Here's the problem with Brokeback Zombie Farm. One, it's a zombie show. There are no zombies in this entire episode. Like, none. I understand simplistic critique, but there are no zombies in a zombie show. This is worth pointing out. It literally has nothing to do with the plot of the show. This is a show where this show could have this entire episode could have taken place completely without a zombie apocalypse.
Here's my problem with what's going on in The Last of Us. For one, I really don't care about gay characters in TV shows or whatever, but I think there's a bigger cultural problem with this. First, in The Last of Us, as in any one of these TV shows, movies, or whatever, let's talk about this. In Harry Potter, there's in the first movie or whatever, there's not a whole lot of like romance or sexual relationship stuff. Even in the later movies, it's only marginal in that Harry, likes Ginny Weasley, and then they clearly like each other. And then in the epilogue, they have a family. And you often don't see gay storylines. And the answer for it's actually quite simple. It's a very, 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 very small market share.
Last of Us Episode 3 happened last night, and it's going exactly how you would expect a project with Neil Druckmann or Neil Cuckman involved. Now, there's a couple of different ways that I want to approach this, because Episode 3 in its own right, I thought was somewhat entertaining. But when you actually look at the people behind it and you look at the agenda that they're trying to push, then you understand that this is not about just telling a story that's going to benefit the overall story. This is about Neil Cuckman pushing the agenda that he couldn't push when he originally made The Last of Us.
I watched the first episode and I thought it was so overrated and not nearly as amazing as people were letting it on to be. That I don't know, I just didn't have any interest. Wasn't for any of the gay stuff, but mind you, the gay episodes appear to be filler episodes. So it's a little funny that this is that in the first season there's going to be 9 episodes total, and at least 2 of those are filler already.
Despite The Last of Us being one of the more beloved games of the past decade, when The Last of Us TV series was announced for HBO, people knew it was a disaster in the making, because Neil Druckmann was very heavily involved, even after the debacle that was The Last of Us Part 2, where Naughty Dog and Neil Druckmann were clearly motivated by identity politics, made changes to the game, decided that they would lie to the fans over and over again, and the fans totally and completely rejected it.
So hello everyone, once again from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and today we are talking about a TV show which actually endorses a communist society. Well, it seems like it's the case in a certain episode of HBO's The Last of Us. But today, I guess, I just wanted to talk about the show overall, my opinion, but mainly focusing on the backlash against this show, mainly from anti-SJWs, conservatives, like, you know the drill at this point. And because you know the drill, hopefully what I've done is played you some sort of montage of various like conservative and anti-SJW voices at the start of this video, because I don't really want to talk about individuals in this video, mainly because upon researching these videos, researching is a weird word for it, you just find they say the exact same thing every single time, because a lot of these people aren't really fans of the games. They're just like drumming up a lot of hysteria. But what's true is that they're not the only people who think this. Although they are capitalizing on this anti-woke sentiment, it's clear there's a lot of people who don't like this show because of their anti-woke views. And I guess what we're going to do is also talk about how this is a kind of carry-on from the backlash to The Last of Us Part 2. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil The Last of Us Part 2. I know it's been out for a while, but now so many people have watched the show without playing the first game, so there's no way you know what happens in Part 2. So I am not going to spoil Part 2 beyond talking about the representation of LGBT people in that game, which prompted the backlash. Don't worry, I'm not actually going to spoil any sort of narrative thing from The Last of Us Part 2, but I am going to spoil everything from The Last of Us Part 1 and HBO's The Last of Us. So if you have not watched or played either of them and you want to keep the story spoiler free, don't watch this video. And before we go any further, please like the video, and in the comments let me know what's the dumbest piece of criticism you've seen directed at the show or the game, mainly through like the anti-woke lens. Like, of course, I don't mind actual criticism. I'm actually going to give some of my own criticism in a sec, but most of it, you know, focusing on like gay couples and stuff is absolutely stupid. So let me know. Also, I don't really shout out my own videos much, but I actually have made a lot of videos on The Last of Us on this channel. I guess my most interesting one is about how Last of Us 1 and 2 are influenced by Israeli politics, and why that is interesting as well is because Neil Druckmann actually reiterated that on HBO's YouTube channel last night after the end of the season. So it is something that is very relevant. I know a lot of people thought it was kind of weird when I made that video without actually watching it, saying I was reaching, but it is very relevant. And if you just type in the Kavernacle Last of Us, I've made a lot of videos on this, including a lot of videos on The Last of Us Part 2. So if you care about any of that stuff, go check out the videos. And while I'm shouting out other things, HBO's YouTube channel, like I said, has a really interesting hour-long podcast hosted by Troy Baker that came out after every episode of the show. It's really, really worth listening to. It's him interviewing Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin about the choices and everything. And also on that note as well, there's actually a longer podcast they made for part 2. They interview the whole cast and crew of both games. So again, go check that out. If you love The Last of Us and you've somehow missed these amazing podcasts, go check them out as well. So before we go into the anti-woke backlash to HBO's The Last of Us, I guess I'd give my opinion on the show building on my love of the game. So I've said this before, I didn't particularly love the original Last of Us. I played it twice, once when I was 17 and once when I was about 20. And I really did like the game. I thought it was far better than Uncharted. But a lot of people often said this was their favourite game of all time, and for me, it was never up there. I just thought it was very enjoyable. I liked the bleak view of humanity in the games. I liked the interesting ending, but like I said, didn't do enough for me. I thought it was fairly conventional in some ways, just because I liked things like The Road. So it reminded me a lot of The Road, but it did have some interesting characterizations. But I guess for me, world building is very important in something becoming like my favourite property. And that's why The Last of Us Part 2 quickly became one of my favourite games, just because the story was absolutely amazing. But I just really like how it built on the foundations of the first game to really kind of expand this world and just get me really hooked in it by giving us so many more characters. I really did enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to playing it for a third time after I complete The Last of Us remake. And that's how I became like a massive fan of The Last of Us. I've even written on my Medium page like what I'd like to see in The Last of Us Part 3. Like I am really, really invested in this. So I was really hyped for the show. I was a bit skeptical of the casting originally, mainly of Bella Ramsey. I thought Pedro Pascal was a really good choice for Joel, even though like Troy Baker himself said, who I thought would be a great Joel as well, he actually said to Josh Brolin when they were going to make a Last of Us movie, like, would you please audition for this role? And if you've seen No Country for Old Men, Josh Brolin is essentially Joel in that movie, so it'd be such great casting. But overall, I thought the show was really, really good, and it's just really nice to see how well it translated to the screen. I also liked a lot of the changes. I guess to start with, I'd say some of the changes I didn't really like. I didn't really like how much bigger the world felt. Like in the first episode, they had that like radio guy, and it seems like people could communicate better. Even with like how Joel met like Bill and Frank is through the radio. And I don't know, like knowing they can communicate like this and seeing like Fedra having helicopters and stuff and talking about these Fedra factories making all these bullets and, you know, like pharmaceutical drugs, I guess it makes sense in the world. I just don't know if I liked it. And I also don't think I like the cordyceps thing in that they are all like connected through these like underground fungal networks. I don't know. I don't really like that because I kind of like how in the Last of Us games, it feels like everywhere is so isolated from each other and there isn't like this communication. It very much is like the world is too dangerous to really establish like these lines of communication where you can talk across the country and stuff. So that is some criticism, but overall I like what they did with most of the expansions of characters. Like I like seeing more from Bill. I like Frank actually becoming a character. That was an absolutely amazing episode, like really, really heart-wrenching at the end there, but of course they got a nice happy ending for what The Last of Us was. And also, like, I enjoyed Bella Ramsey. I thought she really grew into the role. And what I love so much about her performance, especially her violence as Ellie, I really like because she just felt like so feral. She felt like kind of like a zombie herself. What I've always loved about Ellie is how violent she is and that she will not hesitate. She'll get that switchblade and she'll jam it in your neck if she gets a chance. And now talking about the ending, the finale, I did really like it, but again, on different changes. I don't know how much I like Joel admitting that he tried to take his own life, I just felt like that kind of undercut the character a bit. I feel like it was going a bit too far away from what the character was like in the game, mainly because he said that it's not easy to do stuff like this, but I didn't think that implied that he'd actually tried to do it himself. But one last thing I'll say, and it's a bit of a change in the finale, I felt like Pedro Pascal's Joel was overall kind of like a more moral character in that how he acted throughout the show felt like he was like a better version of Joel. But also in that, I feel like he came across as more evil at the end, which I think really speaks to how good a performance it is, because at the end when Ellie is like traumatized by what happened with her and David, and he's been really excited for them to have this life together, it comes across even more one-sided and selfish than it does in the game. And also, in my mind, it doesn't feel like he's seeing Ellie as like a new daughter. He's seeing Ellie as basically like Sarah, like a complete replacement for Sarah, where in the games it kind of feels like for Joel, this is a new daughter and he's a father again. I don't know if any of you took that away from it. So in that sense, it makes Pedro Pascal's Joel's actions seem far more sinister and evil, and even him walking back to Jackson with her at the end, talking about Sarah. In the game, that's quite a nice moment because, you know, Joel is so reluctant to talk about Sarah, and he kind of just says it quick. He's like, you know, I think you would have been good friends. I think you would have liked each other.
I don't think I ever told you, but Sarah and I used to take hikes like this. I think the two of you would have been good friends. I think you really would have liked her. I know she'd have liked you.
I bet I would have.
The way Bella Ramsey's Ellie deals with that conversation makes it a bit more awkward, because it seems like Joel is talking about Sarah in this way because he's kind of talking about like how Ellie is like replacing her or something like that. That's what I got from it. So overall, it felt like more selfish and it felt more sinister, where I feel like their relationship in the game feels a bit more like mutual, even at the end after Joel has done this terrible thing and Ellie kind of doesn't believe the excuse he's given of why she isn't still with the Fireflies. But that's more like my general thoughts and my general criticisms. I could talk about this for like a whole hour. But again, you're not going to see many of these criticisms from Anti-SJW. So for context of people who don't know, this backlash originally started in 2020. So The Last of Us is like a very, very beloved game across the gaming community, the first one. A lot of gamers actually missed the subtext about Bill being gay, and some gamers didn't play the DLC Left Behind, where it is clear that Ellie is also gay and she has like this best friend who's like a romantic interest in Riley, right? So basically when The Last of Us 2 got leaked, sadly, they saw what would be included in the game. And I'm not going to spoil any narrative things, but basically what happens is Ellie is of course gay in the game as well, and there is actually a transgender character as well. So they absolutely freaked out about this, talking about how it was like woke garbage and just pushing like woke politics, despite the fact that Neil Druckmann, who co-directed and wrote the first game, was also doing the second game. So it seemed a bit weird in that regard. They basically had a hate boner for this franchise ever since. There's a whole subreddit called The Last of Us 2, just dedicated to hating on The Last of Us 2. It's really, really pathetic. And in that, they were really anticipating the release of the show, not because they were excited, because they were very, very eager to tear this down as more like woke propaganda. And of course, like I said, Neil Druckmann is heavily involved in the show. He's the co-showrunner with Craig Mazin. He directs one episode. He obviously helped write a lot of these screenplays for these episodes. I want to talk about what they get mad about. Remember, one of the people who made both games is heavily involved in the show. So to start with, I saw a lot of anti-SJWs crying that Sarah, Joel's daughter, would now be played by a black actress. Now, some people were already crying about Joel and Tommy being cast as like Latino men, but I don't think they cared as much, especially because Pedro Pascal has a lot of nerd credibility for Game of Thrones, but especially Mandalorian. So a lot of people generally were just excited that this actor they liked was playing Joel. But what is so confusing to me about all of these criticisms, and we're going to go through them, is that because Neil Druckmann is involved in the whole process, it makes it seem like it's harder to argue that they're changing things for the sake of it and they're just trying to be woke and like ruin the original thing. Because if the guy who was one of the main forces behind the original thing is helping make these decisions, would you not say it's more credible that he picked this actress because she was very good, rather than him and the team picked this actress because she's a black girl. Like, again, it's so ridiculous to even get mad at this anyway. Like, regardless of who was involved in making The Last of Us, getting mad at this is so stupid because, of course, what does her skin color have to do with, like, any of this anyway? But when it's actually the original creator involved, what are you trying to say? What, he's trying to just get brownie points by casting Sarah as a black actress now? So that part was pretty stupid. That they're also crying because you had Joel, Tommy, Sarah, but also Maria is now played by a black actress as well. And they're just being like, oh, look, Hollywood is race swapping. And also what they've always said is, well, if black people want to be represented in Hollywood, why don't they make their own thing? But as we saw, when The Woman King came out, they were crying about that as well. So again, they don't actually care. They just hate seeing diversity on screen. At the same time, the proof is there. These people did such a good job. You just know they got cast these characters because they are great actors or solid actors, and they gave really, really solid performances. But again, these people don't actually care about that. All they see is wokeness, which means diversity, and diversity is bad because why is it bad? Why is it bad that Sarah and Maria are now played by black actresses? Just because you're racist, basically. Like, I can't think of any other reason, because obviously the show is really good. The original creator is involved, so he's okay with this as well. So then it is all on your own bigotry. Now we get to the more infamous controversy. And I actually made a whole video on this because Ben Shapiro is infamous for giving terrible movie reviews. So basically, in the game, you have this character of Bill who lives alone in this town, has booby traps everywhere, and what he's meant to represent to Joel is basically the future. Joel, if you continue being closed off to the world, if you won't let people into your life because you're so scared of being hurt again, like you were 20 years ago when you lost your daughter, Bill is who you will become, because Bill does this because he doesn't want to be hurt by anyone. And the show kind of spanned this on its head a bit, where at the start, Bill is Bill. Like, he seems very similar to the show. He's like this prepper libertarian who already hates people and hates the government, and he's basically been preparing for the end of the world. So then Fedra come round to round everybody up. He doesn't go, takes over the town and makes it like his own little solo libertarian paradise. But then a character who's only referenced in the game, Frank, stumbles upon this town, and it begins the relationship which was hinted at in the game. And instead of making it more subtle, basically it dedicates this whole episode to just Bill and Frank. And in a little twist, 2023 Joel doesn't even meet Bill in the timeline of the game because Bill is already dead. Because Frank and Bill chose to die together because they loved each other so much, because Frank was dying from a terminal illness, and basically it was like a very, very visible depiction of a gay love story. And of course it is significant for depicting a gay love story, but anyone who's ever had a relationship, you can relate to a lot of things you see on screen. And it is very sad because you take their experience and kind of think about yourself in that situation. Like, I don't know about you guys, I was thinking about myself and my girlfriend in the place of Bill and Frank and thinking about how like tragic but also very nice that ending is. But multiple criticisms came at this, and I'm going to show you some thumbnails basically saying The Last of Us is tricking you into watching a gay romance for like one episode. And Ben Shapiro was calling it like Brokeback Mountain. A lot of people were saying this, and one of their main dumb criticisms was it didn't advance the plot at all. And this just shows how badly they read it, because although you can say it was a little detour from the plot, I think it was a very welcome detour from the plot, it still did have an importance to the plot, because unlike Bill being like a visual representation of who Joel will become, Bill writes Joel a letter saying like who you should be. Joel, if you continue to be like how I used to be, then life is just not worth living. So he tells Joel to let people in and like protect Tess. Obviously Tess has already passed away at this point, so that's why he kind of moves on to Ellie, and he's starting to open up more of Ellie at this point. And that is basically what Bill's saying, is that you can't go on like this. It's better to let people in and have a reason to live rather than just hating the world and going on surviving. Like, you and I are protectors and we should exist to protect people that we love. And it was like a nice little message. But also another criticism leveled at it was this did not have enough zombies. Now, I've seen this criticism a bit more towards the end of the show, and I don't think I necessarily agree with it, because Last of Us wasn't ever really about zombies, and that is like, zombie media 101 at this point. And also, if you play Last of Us 2, it really isn't about zombies. Like, there are whole periods, especially towards the end of the game, where the infected are not relevant at all, and they are barely seen at all. I'd say like the last 6 hours of The Last of Us 2, there isn't much infected, kind of similar to parts of part 1, but I think in part 1, there's a lot more like action sequences with the infected. But at this point in part 3, I think we've both seen enough infected, especially because this comes after the test episode. My criticism wouldn't be for part 3, I didn't see zombies in a zombie show, but in the conservative mindset, they're so stupid and so bad at critical thinking, they literally think a zombie show does actually have to be about zombies and the cure. Ben Shapiro probably thinks the importance of this story is just about Joel and Ellie trying to make a cure for the zombie pandemic, not that it's just a backdrop to tell interesting stories about different characters and putting them in interesting scenarios and creating a lot of tension with people like being bitten by zombies and how do they act in those certain circumstances and how does it affect their lives. Not that The Last of Us should just be a show about making a cure to make the world go back to normal or something. Needless to say, the whole discourse around this by anti-SJWs was motivated by a lot of homophobia, and even in Ben Shapiro's stupid criticism about it being a zombie show not showing zombies for an episode, it was pretty much just all about his homophobia and how probably uncomfortable he was watching a gay relationship, including depictions of a gay couple being intimate. What I will say is I can accept the criticism a bit more if people admit it's actually like a well done story. Like, if you watch this Bill and Frank as like an individual movie, I don't think many people would say that's a bad movie, right? It's a very, very well done episode. It's a very, very good episode. But I can understand maybe if you're like, well, I don't like how they change Bill's character. And for me personally, I think Bill actually works better in the game as this visual depiction of what Joel will become rather than this letter. But I can still accept it because I'm like, well, Bill is a far better character in this. His story is far more interesting. So if his use in Joel's own story isn't as good in my opinion, I don't really care because I also have the game to play with a completely different cast in a story that is very different in many ways to what I'm seeing on the show. I'm open to new stuff because why would you just want to be shown the exact same thing just on television? So this is the backlash I'm excited to talk about the most. It's about Last of Us episode 6. And episode 6 was cool because we got to see Jackson. Now, in part 1, you don't see Jackson. You see some glimpses of it, but it's mainly focused on this dam that powers Jackson. Now, where the show differs is it basically takes influence from The Last of Us Part 2, where you actually see a lot of Jackson, especially in the first couple hours, and it lets us see Jackson for what it is. And I really like this because I love Part 2, so I'm happy to see Jackson get a more visible representation in the story of part 1. Now, because I've listened to so many interviews about this game, I know even in the game, Neil Druckmann said that Jackson is supposed to be a socialist society. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the socialist society is also shown to be a better society. Now, in The Last of Us show, it isn't even subtle because as Joel is getting shown round, seeing how it is like collective ownership and stuff like this, seeing how democratic this town is, he comments, "So communism?" And Tommy says, "Well, it's not like that." And Maria says, "Yeah, we are literally communists. This is a commune." So it's one of the rare depictions of communism in a positive way in mainstream television or anything, really. And of course, people were getting mad about this. Now, maybe not as much as other things, but I did see a couple videos about how The Last of Us Episode 6 is commie propaganda. The Last of Us 6 goes communist. Just before we delve into how stupid the backlash to that is, what people are often saying is actually the game condemns communism because at the end, Ellie asks Joel, like, did things used to be like that? And Joel says, no, things didn't used to be like that. Some people wanted to own everything. He also says that couldn't work in a larger society. So people are like, oh, Joel is saying communism bad, therefore the show is saying communism bad, even when everyone involved in the show creatively has always said Ellie is smarter than Joel. Joel is not meant to be some like intellectual or anything like that. The writers are saying like this communist system can't work in the real world. That's one thing, but it is interesting for these people to get mad that humans would act in a more collectivist manner to literally survive the apocalypse, right? Like, how would neoliberalism work in Jackson? Like, how would neoliberalism help in any way? Like, these humans want to survive now. That is the goal. The world we know has absolutely gone. They're trying to live, and in Jackson's case, they're actually thriving. How would you do that? You couldn't do it through neoliberalism because you'd just be creating capitalism in the post-apocalypse, and that's never going to work. So what you see, the two sides of like mainstream society, you have Fedra, which is fascist authoritarian, and you have Jackson, which is communist essentially. And even in the podcast I was talking to you about, they said we are making a comment on society, and we are very much saying one is better than the other, and we're saying Jackson is better both than the religious society you see later on, and it's better than Fedra as well. What I always say when I talk about like my communist views and stuff is that I think humans are fundamentally a cooperative species, and we are. But the problem being is lots of people now are brainwashed by neoliberal capitalism, which makes them act in a certain way, which I think goes against our basic programming, because humans have always collaborated to survive. Yes, we have like tribal differences and stuff like that, but when we need to actually survive, we will work together. In essence, that's a lot of what communism is, isn't it? It's like people will help society in the ways they can help for all of us to survive and for all of us to hopefully thrive. And that's what's happening in Jackson. And if you see Jackson in part 2, people like Ellie, people like Tommy, people like Joel, they are the people who guard Jackson because they are good at violence. They are good at killing infected. They are good at shooting. That's what they do. Ellie, Joel, and Tommy don't do the farming. They don't tend the horses. They're not the butchers because that's not what they're best at. They're assigned to the things that they're good at, while the other people are assigned to the things they're good at, and they all work together to make it work. And I actually have said this before, even though it's in the post-apocalypse, I actually kind of want to live in Jackson in real life because it does really seem like a communist kind of utopia in a way. Like, it does really seem like a good place to live. And it's so seductive to Joel and Tommy because it seems so nice. Like, Tommy even says, there were better ways to survive than what we did. We just weren't good at them. Joel on the TV show says, yeah, I'm coming back. In the game, he doesn't say that. So again, I do love this positive depiction of communism, but it also makes sense. In the comments, if you're like a conservative capitalist or just a capitalist, can you please make the argument to me of why neoliberal capitalism would work better in the post-apocalypse? I would really love to see some sort of like Ayn Rand utopia in the world of The Last of Us. That would be pretty funny. So yes, according to The Last of Us, communism good, and we are very, very happy that it did show people this. But also, come on, even if you don't think communism can work for every country or the whole of the world, you have to admit it does make sense in the context of The Last of Us or the context of the post-apocalypse, because what other system are you actually going to utilize that will create like a somewhat good society? Like, look at Fedra in the games. Do you want to live in a Fedra zone? Look at these other militias in like part 2 and the show. You want to live under their control? It does seem like such a better way to exist in this world. Now, moving on, one of the other criticisms again was about homophobia, and this one was more stupid because it's like this relationship wasn't even like subtle in the game. So what people were crying about was that there was another episode in The Last of Us dedicated to this friendship and kind of romance between Ellie and Riley. Up until this point, we haven't seen any flashbacks of Ellie. We don't know Ellie's backstory. So this episode is like absolutely like vital for seeing what Ellie's always been like, for seeing her in Fedra, and for seeing like her first like real meaningful relationship with Riley, and also seeing Ellie as gay. People were calling this like more gay propaganda. That's how you'll view this if you just have an anti-woke brain, because this episode is so important for character development, not just to show a gay relationship. That's part of it, but it's just to show what Ellie has lost and how much she has had to sacrifice throughout her life. And it's just so important. But even at the end, literally the last scene, it ties back to this episode where Ellie says she had to kill Riley. That is just implied in the game. You kind of think, what happened after Riley turned into a zombie and Ellie didn't? But now Ellie's like, nah, yeah, I had to do that. I had to do that to my best friend. The only person I love in this world, I had to do that to them. That's why it's relevant. That's why it's so important, on top of just being a very, very good episode that builds on a very, very fun DLC. But again, it was in the original game. This came out in 2014, DLC for the original game. If you bought the PS4 remastered version, it was bundled in. If you played the Part 1 remake, it was in that as well. So how can you complain about this? Not only how can you complain about this, the original creator of the game and the DLC works on the show. That episode is so similar to the DLC. What is to complain about? Like, sure, if you want to cry about it, you can cry about it like 9 years ago. But again, how can you cry about it today and act like the show is purposefully going out of its way to show you gay relationships, especially in this instance when it's literally just showing you what was in the game, but it's actually dedicating even less time than it had in the game? Why can you complain about this? Again, it shows they will never be satisfied. They just don't want to see gay characters. Do you think Tim, Paul, and others would be outraged if they cut out this relationship? If Riley never existed and Ellie wasn't even visibly gay in the show, do you think they'd care? Of course they wouldn't. They wouldn't be saying, oh, you destroyed The Last of Us, you destroyed the original game, you destroyed the creator's intent. They'd be like, oh, that's great. Less wokeness in The Last of Us. That's what needed to be edited out. When you have this like anti-woke brain rot, you can't be consistent in your arguments because a lot of the time they complain about accuracy. When something is adapted for television or movies, a lot of the things they cry about is accuracy to the original source material. I think The Last of Us is one of the most accurate adaptations of a game I've ever seen, including this episode as well. But they're still crying about it, saying it's like woke, trying to force gay relationships in your face. Again, they don't care. And a lot of these people, of course, don't actually even like the game. They probably never even played the game. So they just see the show and be like, oh, it's trying to force gay relationships in your face. People clamour for things to be accurate. This is being accurate. Do you want them to change it? Do you want them to change Ellie's character because you fundamentally are a bigot? So those are all the things I wanted to talk about in like a list. And I think it fundamentally shows the problem with anti-woke kind of politics and an anti-woke worldview. And I think The Last of Us is the best representation of the hypocrisy. So Neil Druckmann co-directed the first game, wrote the first game, directed the second game, co-wrote the second game, is the fundamental inspiration for so many of his characters and what they do. He's one of the head guys on the HBO show as well with Craig Mazin. They're still acting as if this adaptation is made by people with like no connection to the game, and they're changing things because they want to, and they're ruining stuff because they want to. Like Neil Druckmann is fundamentally ruining the story of 1 because he's making Bill like a more fleshed out character. But why would he do that? Do you honestly think he would cannibalize his own work for woke brownie points, for example? Do you honestly think he would do that? But these people do think he'd do that. They do think after Last of Us Part 2, with the gay representation, the LGBT representation, that somehow that's all he cares about. And even them complaining about Riley and Ellie's relationship just shows they don't care about accuracy. They don't care about the game staying true to the source material, because even when it does, they find a way to complain. They find a way to complain about The Last of Us pushing gay politics down your throat, as if the game didn't cover people being gay as well. And I'm really looking forward to the absolute meltdown that's going to come with the next couple seasons of the show. So anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.